Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. We're very glad to have you all here this morning at this symposium organized by the Afro-Middle East Center and IHAHA on Egypt, and focusing 3 years after the uprisings in Egypt began on the 25th of January 2011, focusing on what has happened over the past 3 years, and particularly where the democratic process has gone or not gone in Egypt thus far. In your little information pack, you have a brochure which outlines the concept of the conference as well as details of the program and some of the speakers. So I'm not going to go into detail about that. Let me begin by welcoming our two speakers for this first session, the opening session. And this opening session is called Setting the Basis for Discussing Egypt's Future, which we'll hopefully do for the rest of the program. Our two speakers are Yahya Hamid and Deputy Minister Ibrahim. Yahya Hamid was Minister of Investments in the Mohamed Morsi administration, the cabinet of President Mohamed Morsi in Egypt. He holds a master's in public administration from the Arab Academy of Science and Technology and a sales diploma from the American University of Cairo. He was also involved with the president's election campaign and was an advisor to the president. Our second speaker is Deputy Minister Ibrahim, who's Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in the government of South Africa, has a long history in the struggle in South Africa and in the African National Congress, which I won't go into. Some of it is in the brochure that you have. Suffice it to say that don't be fooled by his very soft manner of speaking. He was a commander in the ANC's Mkhonto we Sizwe, and for that was arrested and severely tortured and imprisoned more than once on Robben Island. With that, I'll begin by calling Yahya Hamid to speak first.
Welcome as well, His Excellency, the Deputy Minister. And I'm quite glad to be here with one of the nations that supports democracy, that supports freedom and the rule of law. While I'm speaking to you now, the President, Dr. Mohamed Morsi, and many others of his administration are being judged now in a court for fleeing away during the 25th of Jan revolution from one of the prisons. Very dubious crime, very silly one, and is being put in one of the prisons in the police academy, and along with other crimes of treason with other nations, with other countries like Palestine. And this is how we reach it till now. Definitely, I would have loved, during the anniversary of the 3 years of the 25th of Jan revolution, to tell you about the success that the Egyptians have done, about the democracy that we have reached, about the freedom of speech that all the people, from the youth, from the journalists, from people who are working in NGOs are celebrating, about the 5 electoral steps that we have done, from the constitution, the referendum, the Shura Council, which is the upper house, and the parliamentary, as well as the presidential elections. Definitely, I would have loved to tell you about the steps that we have started to take in order to flourish our economy, steps that we have done in order to create a really balanced international relationships with other countries. But here we are, and these are the steps in order to acquire real freedom. And unfortunately, we are here telling you that there is a kind of crackdown for the real revolution by the counter-revolution, but people deny to have this counter-revolution as something that will last And inshallah, God wills, maybe we will be invited soon to South Africa again to celebrate the winning of the real revolution. In order to understand the circumstances in Egypt and why the revolution of the 25th of Jan started or erupted, we need to assess where our country in Egypt have reached after 60 years of the ruling of the military people and the generals of the army. I'm going to tell you some facts. In the economical sector, we have more than 25% of our people, the 90 million Egyptian people across the 27 governorates, are under poverty line. More than 20% are illiterate. The unemployment, the announced one, are 13%, and the real one exceeds 26%. We are the number one of the importing country for wheats. Number one. Probably this is the only thing that we have succeeded in during the 60 years of the ruling of the military arms, to be the number one importing country in wheats. And I can tell you many other examples where real deterioration in economy have took place during the 60 years. I can tell you about the 2% of the elites in Egypt who governed Egypt and took all the benefits in Egypt. 2% only. I can tell you about the tens and hundreds of bids that went for the companies that are being owned by the military arm and for the oligarchy or the elites that belong to the deep state as well. In the political arena, you couldn't, during Mubarak time, to establish any kind of political party unless you take the approval of the parliament and you take the approval of the political committee in the parliament that's being headed by his son, Gamal Mubarak. And definitely, you always fail to get any kind of approval. So during the 30 years, we were banned from doing or practice any kind of our political benefits or political practice, any kind. In every other sector or pillar of life, you can find that we have deteriorated even from the cultural space, from the ethical space, from the social problems and the divorce rate that started to be very increased during the last 10 years. So people start, especially the youth, to say, we will never be able to accept such a life, we will never be able to lead such a future. We have to say no. And on the 25th of Jan, 2011, thousands of people started to be in the streets of downtown, in Tahrir Square, trying to be there, in other governorates in Suez, and there in Suez we had our first martyr, our first youth who lost his life. And on the same day, like today, which is the 28th of January, we had the Jum'ah. It was a Jum'ah day, Friday, and we had the what we call Yawm al-Ghadab, or the anger day. And there you had more than 17 million going into the streets, a real 17 million, not like the one you heard about in 30th of June, a real 17 million in every place in Egypt. After the Jum'ah prayer, they went and they said one word: we want this system down, the whole system down. They asked only for three things, very basic ones. In your country, you asked about the same things years ago. They asked for bread, they asked for freedom, and they asked for social justice. And in order to elaborate on this, this is very important. They asked for bread because actually a lot of families are being deprived from bread and being deprived from the least acceptable level of any human being. They asked for real freedom politically from the states, from Israel, from Europe, a real freedom of speech, a real freedom to practice the political rights, a real freedom for women, a real freedom for kids, a real freedom. They asked for this. And they asked for social justice. There are people inside the government, and we have 6 million workers inside the government. People of them are taking almost 500,000 salary every month, and others are taking 100 Egyptian pounds or 150 Egyptian pounds only, which is an equivalent to around $30 a month. They asked for social justice. And if you asked anyone on the 24th of Jan, how long will it take you to be in the streets in order to bring Mubarak down? And he told you then it will take 18 days only, you would call him an insane. Because Mubarak deep-rooted state, no one have ever imagined that it's going to take only 18 days to step him down. And if you ask me now, how long will be the streets in order to regain our revolution and regain our freedom, I will tell you sooner than anyone expects. With all the atrocity, with all the violence, with all the aggression that's being happened, with all the gunshots and the bird shots that we are having in our bare chests, yes, it's going to take very soon because the people have understood what it takes to sacrifice. Inshallah. The deep state wanted to control over 5 institutions. And these institutions are the real cause of the counter-revolution that happened during the 3rd of July. They had their arms on the police, they had their arms over the army, and this means that anyone who opposed the system were not allowed at all to enter the army or the police. And they controlled the judiciary system. And many of the people that you see now as judges, they are the sons of an ex-judges, and they were not very prominent in their schools. And the first people in the universities were not taken as prosecutor generals or in the judiciary system. So unfortunately, they are corrupted like their predecessors. So they controlled the judiciary systems and they controlled the media. Either the state-owned media or the ones that are being owned by the wealthy businessmen who belong to the deep state as well. And the last one, they control the business environment. So if you want to work in steel or iron, or if you want to work in cement, or if you want to work in petroleum and gas, you have to have the bless of the family, of Mubarak's family. You cannot be a normal one who has his own connections or a wealthy one in order to enter this space. You can't. These are the 5 things that the people even unconsciously went on the 25th and the 28th of Jan calling for stepping down. And probably no one understood then the level of corruption and the level of deep state that this country was living under for the past 60 years. And now we understand why the army rules stood against the freedom of the people and the will of the people during the 3rd of July in order to preserve such benefits, in order to preserve their elites, in order to preserve their corrupted country, but they will not succeed. During the eve of 2011, a bomb blasted in Alexandria, in a church that called Al-Qiddisin Church, the Saints Church. It killed tens of people, and the first statement from the military, from the Ministry of Interior, was that Islamists have done this. And they quote a youth, a young man, called Sayyid Bilal. They tortured him to death. And right after the 11th of February 2011, the stepping down of Mubarak, by documents it was apparent that those who articulated this is the Minister of Interior himself. And this, why I'm telling you this now, because you have to understand who is doing the bomb right now in Egypt, who is the real one who's benefiting from this. We have cleared it from the first day of the Rab'a Satin that our peacefulness is our army, is our weapon. Our peacefulness is the one, or is the real thing, and the one thing that's gonna make us succeed. It's never the violence, and they want us to go into the violence in order to use more weapons and more atrocity and more violence than us. This is as if we have been victims during the last year. No, we haven't. We have been very resilient. We have been very solid. We have done a lot of achievements and a lot of mistakes, we have to admit. I'm going to tell you some of the achievements that the government and His Excellency the President, the legitimate President of Egypt, the one elected President of Egypt since 7,000 years, Dr. Mohammed Morsi, has achieved along with his administration. In tourism, we have achieved from 15 to 20% growth year over year, and we almost touchlined with the highest ever year in tourism, which was 2010, and we almost achieved 13 million tourists coming to Egypt, bringing the increase of the revenue by 15 to 20%. This is actually the second highest revenue after the Suez Canal that brings foreign currency to Egypt and brings and flourish economy. Now, under the oppression of the military regime, the number of the tourists have dropped down 75% during the last 6 months. 75%. 4 to 5 million Egyptian people are working in the tourism sector, and we have been accused that we're gonna close this sector because we belong to the Islamic ideology, and definitely we said we will not. Actually, we flourished more this sector, and the president himself went to many countries, one of which is Germany, where I was with him, and he talked very directly to tourism sector and tourism industry people, and from Germany only, right after his visit by 1 month, the number increased of tourism from Germany by 20%. In the GDP growth, during the year of his ruling, we have achieved a GDP growth by 2.4%. During the SCAF, which is the army ruling in the interim period from the 25th of Jan or from the 11th of February till he was elected, the 18-month, the GDP growth was only 1.7%. Unfortunately, this year, the expectations and the forecast under the military rule will be only 1.1%. So we have achieved 2.4%, and our aim was to achieve from 3.5 to 4% this year. We have created from 600 to 650,000 jobs opportunity. Unfortunately, under Sisi rule, they have lost around 300,000. We have opened many multinationals came to Egypt because they felt that the democracy and they felt that the stability of the country is a real good environment for them to invest in Egypt. One of them was Samsung, and they opened in a governorate called Beni Suef, which is not even in Cairo or in Giza. It's one of the Upper Egypt, and this is the first multinational, a good one, that opens there in Beni Suef, where it could have created thousands of jobs. Their opening date was in July 2013. Unfortunately, it didn't open till now. We have created the first and manufactured the first iPad. We don't even hear about it right now. We have changed a lot of laws, around 3 to 4 laws that would have invited more investors to come and invest in Egypt. One of them is to securing their investment, their old investments, and to do some reconciliations with the problematic cases of the state-owned companies that were sold during Mubarak time with a very cheap price. We have brought 3 billion Egyptian pounds, which is an equivalent to 600 million. I'm sorry, 300 million for the small and medium enterprises and for the micro projects as well. We have spent, and this is a record, more than 75% of the allocated investment state budget over the governorates, really focusing on Sinai and really focusing on Upper Egypt. Sinai, in the new budget, had 4.5 billion Egyptian pounds to be invested in 6 months. Now, after the 6 months, 0 has been invested. Actually, the government has invested in buying weapons in order to crack down any kind of protests that happened in Sinai. They call them terrorists. We had 4 visits to Africa, and the president came to South Africa, and he attended the African summit, and he said very clearly that during Mubarak's time, we have abandoned Africa, and this is a very unwise decision. He spoke about his dream to have a train from Alexandria to Cape Town. He spoke about his dream to have a bridge covering from Saudi Arabia to Egypt. He spoke about his dream in order to be part of the BRICS and to have the e-BRICS. Last but not least, we have done a lot of things in order to bring democracy into light. We have built free elected institutions by the 5 electoral voting system that we had. We had to ban any kind of detainment of journalists during Dr. Morsi time, and we had a real free of expression that sometimes went, I wouldn't say beyond the line, but went off stream. And we have done a real empowerment for women and a real empowerment for youth, and I'm speaking for you, with you, and 4 to 5 people were under 45 years old in the last cabinet. We have done a lot of attempts of inclusion for other people, but we could have done more, I admit. Because all of this, because our trials and our attempts to bring real democracy and bring real freedom to Egyptian people, in order to unshackle the coffles that the army have put in our hands during the last 60 years, because we have really had a dream for our people, a dream of democracy and a dream of freedom and a dream of a rule of law that Sisi, along with others, have did this plot. But I assure you that people inside and is on the streets for the last 200 plus days, and they can go for their lifetime in the streets, not to be back into authority, but to be back into real freedom. Thank you.
Mr. Hamid, of course, outlined the present situation in Egypt. And I see the other speakers are going to deal with the question of from democracy to military rule and what is the roadmap all about in Egypt. So I think I'll just want to concentrate on what has been the South Africa's position as far as the Egyptian situation is concerned. But of course, I also wish to emphasize the fact that when Egypt marked the 3rd anniversary of the uprising, unfortunately, about 47 people were killed and about 1,000 people arrested. And that brings up the total death since what Hamid called the counter-revolution, over 1,000 people in Egypt. So you could see that there is an increasing repression by the military government. We look at Egypt as part of the Arab Spring, starting in Tunisia, Libya. We find that there are problems now in Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. Of course, one could argue whether this is really a spring, a word that comes from the Eastern European uprising during the Soviet era. When the revolution took place in 2011, the army seemed to have played some role in bringing about this transformation. And probably in some way facilitating the downfall of Mubarak. And I think that role of the army still has remained in the Egyptian polity, still has remained as a force. And now we see how the army has once again come up to determine the direction of Egyptian politics. Now, I don't want to go into the whole question of what transpired at the anniversary of the uprising and the takeover by the army that on the 3rd of July 2013, the Egyptian Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, headed of course by Sisi, announced that President Morsi has been removed, and it followed up with the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood, the suppression of the media, it followed by arrest, and the killing of demonstrators, etc., etc. I'm sure those are the issues that you'll go into later on. Of course, then they started the process of drafting a new constitution. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, not part of this process of drafting a new constitution. Of course, they were a banned organization now, and with the repression, with the arrest and detention and the killings, we found that there was no real free political activity that enabled any political party or organization to participate freely in the drafting of the new constitution. And the way the constitution was drafted too, it was appointed by the army, I think of 50 people. If you now compare that with our constitution making process, which was very inclusive, very transparent, and involved, it was all inclusive in the sense that all parties, even those parties that just represented the briefcase without any following, were brought into the constitution making process. and we continuously brought in civil society as part of the constitution-making process, which then gave legitimacy to the constitution. But the manner in which this constitution was drafted, one could argue that it doesn't have the type of legitimacy because the process of drafting a constitution is as important, sometimes more important than the constitution itself, because the process then gives legitimacy to the constitution. And of course, the constitution was put to a referendum. The turnout rate was 38.6%. Now it is argued that it was more than the 33% the constitution turnout introduced by Morsi. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood boycotted at the referendum, and of course you were not allowed to campaign for the boycott. You're not allowed to put up posters, not to take part in the constitution, and everything was done to suppress the boycott of the constitution. Of course, the new constitution, we are told, has a number of positive elements. There are articles that clearly state rights to education, healthcare, and shelter, and grant equality between men and women. Article in the 2000, they said that some people say in the 2012 constitution there was some indication that there was some threat to the freedom of speech. However, it should be noted that both the 2012 and 2013 constitution reflected a flawed exclusionary process that allowed the winning coalition to enshrine their interest in the constitution. A constitution ought to reflect national consensus. Repeating old mistakes will in the long term not lead to different results. Now, the new constitution, as Mr. Hamdi said, entrenches military rule, giving the army, I think, the right to appoint a minister of defense, although it is set for the period of 8 years. And it also does away with civilian control. And it says that it makes provision for the creation of a Supreme Council to oversee the Interior Minister. I'm sure in the course of this discussion we'll hear more about how the military seeks to play this role, which is very undemocratic in a democratic society. You do not get the military playing this role of directing and controlling the government or the civilian government. And what is South Africa's position? See, we have had, what this step does very much was that we were hopeful that this revolution will lead to a democratic process in Egypt. We find, if you compare it now with Tunisia, Tunisia has moved very far in this process of democratization. It has a new constitution now and is hoped to have elections. And you see, as I've said in another meeting, that if you take what happened in Algeria in the early 90s, where the Islamic Party wins the election, in a free and fair election, but the army steps in to say that no, you cannot rule despite the fact that you went through this democratic process. Hamas wins the election in Palestine. It's quite a free and fair election. But the Western powers make sure that Hamas doesn't rule. It doesn't rule. That is why you had now this problem of Gaza, where there's an attack on Hamas and Hamas takes over Gaza, which doesn't bring about stability in Gaza or in the Palestinian territory. A democratic election is held and the Muslim Brotherhood wins. Now, whether you agree with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood or with the Hamas, etc., that's not the point. The point is that you've opened a democratic space for all parties, even the Islamist Party, to participate and bring them into the democratic process. The experience of Algeria was very painful because when they stepped in, it led to a bitter civil war. I think Algeria is still facing the aftermath of that civil war. So the message you are sending to Islamist parties that there's no place for you in the democratic process, that you cannot take part in democratic elections and rule in a democratic country. So then what is the alternative? What is the alternative? They would ask now, what is the alternative? If you cannot be in a democratic process, then the other alternative is what happened in Algeria. I'm not saying that it was going to happen in Egypt, but if it does, the consequence will be more drastic than what happened in Algeria, because Egypt is a large country, has a large population, and I think it has a lot of arms that are flowing in Egypt. I think that's a lesson that has to come out, that if you want peace and stability, you've got to open up the democratic process to all parties, whether you agree with them or not, and let the people themselves decide as to whom they want, what party they want to rule in their country. Now, the South African position on the 5th of July, that is 2013, the African Union suspended Egypt pending the restoration of the democratic process. This is not the first time the African Union has been doing that. We did that in Madagascar. Both the African Union and SADC suspended it because there was an unconstitutional change of government. This was in terms of what we call the Lome Declaration, Article 30 of the AU Constitutive Act and Chapter 4 of the AU Charter, in terms of which any unconstitutional change in power would necessitate an African Union suspension. Of course, we in South Africa then also issued a statement condemning what we called unconstitutional change of government, and many countries in the world did the same. Otherwise, we supported the position of the African Union, which was a very principled position. As I said, that not only, it is not the first time that the African Union has taken such a position. Of course, the interim government of Egypt didn't take to our statement kindly. And for some reason, they singled out South Africa. They issued a statement attacking us. It's interesting that the attack came from the former Egyptian ambassador to South Africa, Mona Umar. I'm sure some of your South Africans would know her. And one got an impression that she really loved South Africa. but they viciously attacked our country. Now we said, no, this decision was taken by the Peace and Security Council of the AU. And we are not members of the Peace and Security Council. We were members in the past, but we were no longer members when this decision was taken. So we don't know why the attack should be directed towards South Africa. Of course, then they said that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the former foreign minister of South Africa, is heading the Peace and Security Council, heading the commission, and therefore she influenced. Well, she didn't influence, she merely chairing the meeting. And this came unanimously from members of the Peace and Security Council. What is all is saying to us? The situation is created. We think, if you look back to Algeria, and I said that that it doesn't give you, it doesn't create a positive attitude towards what we call the Arab Spring. It's a very bad example to set, where there is need for democratic transition in the Arab world. I was listening to the Geneva II. We have been invited to be part of the Geneva II. And when Brahimi was here during Nelson Mandela's funeral, he also wanted our assistance on a number of things. And whether we agree with the Syrian, either the opposition or the government, but the Syrian foreign minister was talking about the rule of the royalty in many of the Arab states, and the irony was that Saudi Arabia wanted to have fighting for democracy and a democratic system and freedom of press, etc., in Syria. Well, Egypt doesn't doesn't create a positive image, and doesn't inspire people in the Arab world to move towards a democratic system. As I said, whether we like the Muslim Brotherhood or not, whether we like Islamic ideology or not, or we like the Salafist, those of us who interacted with Muslim Brotherhood did find that they are a group that would be sensitive to the democratic process, that in their orientation, they are sensitive to. I went to Egypt and we had lengthy discussions with all the parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafist, and the liberal element, as we did with Al-Nada in Tunisia, and with Ghanouchi and others. And we got the sense that they were committed. They knew that they had to move the country forward in a democratic process. And it was unfortunate that they were not given the opportunity to do so. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood have said from time to time that they are not a violent organization. They have not used violence. Now, they have condemned violence in the past. I was asking someone in my office this morning about the attack that took place in Luxno, in the 90s, where the foreigners were killed. And Muslim Brotherhood condemned it, but there's no evidence. There's no evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood has ever used violence, now or in the past. And if the matter is to be resolved in Egypt, we have to have an all-inclusive dialogue. It could lead, if not the Muslim Brotherhood, you cannot resolve the problem in Egypt if you do not have an all-inclusive dialogue. Without exception to anybody, you cannot ban organization and prohibit organization from becoming part of the dialogue and part of the our process. Now, as I said that there was violence in Algeria, we have unfortunately already begun to see some violence taking place in Egypt, especially with the bombings in Cairo this past Friday and Saturday, in which the Sinai-based jihadist group Ansar Beit al-Maqdis claimed responsibility. If that happened in Egypt, it will have very ghastly consequences, because Egypt is not Algeria. It is a very, very large country, and it's an important country in the Arab world, not only in that part of Africa, but in the Arab world as such. Now, then there is, of course, sectarian violence that is emerging. We see that the bombing of the church and trying to create sectarian violence. I think Egypt had a very peaceful coexistence. Like in Syria, for instance, in Syria before the uprising, you will find Muslims, Christians, even the Jewish community living in peace. But you introduce sectarian violence, which will have a very drastic consequences. Morsi was there for a short time. It is true that he made some mistakes, as people say, but it's also true that he has been very accommodating. In his cabinet, only about 30% of them belong to the Muslim Brotherhood. And even in parliament, he was prepared to make a number of concessions, and he called for engagement and dialogue with the opposition. As you see that we have gone back to the Mubarak era, and the fear is that we will go back to what we had under Mubarak. Ultimately, a successful transition to democracy in Egypt will depend on meaningful opportunities for all political forces in that society to participate peacefully in the political process. For peace and stability to be achieved in Egypt, the national reconciliation process must include all parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party. Let's not forget that the Muslim Brotherhood or Freedom and Justice Party have won every election in Egypt since the departure of President Mubarak in January 2011. True national reconciliation has to be inclusive. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, the international community should come out very strongly in support of new initiative. A dialogue which must include all parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood, which means that people like Morsi should be released, and the charges against the other members of the Muslim Brotherhood should be dropped. Unfortunately, the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood and the outcome of the 2014 referendum will make the military more confident and less interested in a settlement with the opposition. Should there be no reconciliation between the Muslim Brotherhood, the military, the interim government, and other political role players, it is if that does not happen, I think there is highly likelihood that the country could descend into violence and instability. And I think it was said by the last speaker that Egypt was making progress, economic progress, trying to establish political stability. But if there's no inclusive dialogue, I think unfortunately the country is going to descend into chaos. As far as the African Union is concerned, African Union had appointed a committee of elders to go and negotiate with the Egyptian authorities. Unfortunately, the Egyptian government didn't allow this process. I'm told now that that they would be allowed in, but there are some conditions. I think one of the conditions is that they should not speak to the opposition. You can't go into a country to try to resolve problems not talking to everyone. Of course, it is clear that Sisi is going to stand for election. It became clear yesterday. They are going to now have the presidential election first and then the parliamentary election later on. But instability in Egypt. Egypt is an important country for the African Union, for us as well in South Africa. Egypt played an important historical role in the non-aligned movement and even supporting the liberation of many African countries, even Asian countries, including our own country. It's an important country in the Arab world. And an instability, a long period of instability is not going to assist both the continent of Africa and the Arab world. So I think the international community, now I saw the Lady Ashton welcoming the referendum. It seems that the Europeans and probably the Americans will be moving towards recognizing the new constitution. And I'm not sure what the African Union is going to do. There's an African Union summit that is meeting presently in Addis Ababa, and it'll be interesting to know what the African Union is going to do. But we feel that the only way out is to release all political prisoners, including the president, engage in a genuine, all-inclusive dialogue, and prepare a roadmap based on the will of all the parties in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you to both our speakers, Yahya Hamid and Deputy Minister Ibrahim. We have a few minutes left, and I'm going to, instead of making my own comments, I thought I'd open it up for discussion and spend the next few minutes in any questions people might have or comments that people might want to make on the two presentations that we had this morning. Sorry, do these mics work here? Yes, okay. And we have roving mics for speakers. Please keep your comments and questions as short as possible, and more than 1 minute is a bit too long. First there, and then down here. Nazli? Down here, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalid Ghisaimi. I teach law at UNISA. Thank you for the speakers. I'm so happy to see you. I commend you, and I respect what your past administration has done. My worries...
You're talking to Yahya now, not to Deputy Minister.
Of course.
He's still in the administration.
We respect our Deputy Minister. My worries as a Palestinian, that Egypt gives support all the time to the Palestinian cause. And the strength of the Egyptian army gives a lot of moral support to us. Yet now the Egyptian army became against its own nation and against the cause of the Palestinian. It is clear the approach of the army is against the Palestinian cause. My will is once more that you promised us that you will come back as a legitimate government or a legitimate leadership. I hope that will be very soon. My worry is how you will restore the legitimacy of the army once more.
Thank you,
And
Khalid.
this is serious.
Yeah. Omar, down here, Ambassador Alawi. Omar, I should just say, just met with an accident on his way. Forward, Omar.
Okay.
Yeah, second row. He's a bit disoriented because he met with an accident on his way to the conference. That's why he was late. He's okay though, he says.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Naeem, for organizing this seminar, and also thank you to both speakers for sharing their thoughts with us. I have two questions and comments to make. My question to Mr. Hamid, he mentioned some details about some of the achievements of the Morsi's government, and he also admitted that there were mistakes, but he didn't go into details. If you could maybe expand a little bit and share with us what he accepts as mistakes. I think this is important because we need to reflect on both the achievements and the mistakes in order to learn from what happened. Mr. Ibrahim has mentioned the importance of having an inclusive process, inclusive democracy. I would like to add to that from our own experience in Iraq that for the new democratic system to be looked at positively by the majority of the population, it does also require to deliver and deliver meaningful results. And for the Egyptians, as the Minister Hamid has also said, the problems of unemployment, poverty, inequality, and corruption, and so on, have been there for too long, and people were obviously hoping and waiting to see some meaningful results there. As to what the outsiders could do, and Minister Ibrahim is very right in saying that Egypt is an important country. It's one of the very important countries in the Arab world. It's one of the large African countries, has the third or fourth economy, and has always played an important political role in the history of the continent. So it's in our interest to see a stable, prosperous democracy in Egypt as it is in the other countries in the region. My point is when it comes to helping the Egyptians or helping any other nations going through transition, sometimes it doesn't help to make your views public or go through media and statements and so on. And I think it's more helpful to do that through bilateral meetings and real diplomacy and so on. I think South Africa is in a good position to help the Egyptians to move forward towards achieving a stable and prosperous democracy.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll take one there, Omar, in the second row. Yeah. Oh, Nazlia, second row. And then we'll take one more in the third row, Omar, and then we'll allow
Thank you
the
so much.
speakers to respond.
My name is Sabir Ibrahim. I'm a South African origin from Sudan, and also victims of the so-called Muslim Brothers in Sudan. Been in exile for 19 years. I do respect Mr. Ibrahim and the position of South Africa in principle. Democratic is the way forward. But for me, democracy is not just costing the vote. Constitutions. What constitution governs Egyptians? Colorful societies, Muslim, Jew, Christians. Islam, political Islam constitution can govern Muslim Egyptians. The Muslim brothers in Egypt pushing the agendas of Islamic constitutions, inclusive, exclusive, the whole Egyptians. Egyptians are not Muslim brothers. They are minorities in Egypt. They are minorities. And Muslim brothers, Mercies commit hell of a mistake. You never mention about the mercy have done. The issue is that how we approach to bring the Egyptians in one platform. The same project of Muslim brothers in Sudan, divide Sudan to two. What happened in Tunisia? What happened in Egypt, in Libya? What happened in Algeria? They always come with the projects by themselves. I regard themselves, this is my own experience, is an apartheid Islamic coup. What they have done in Sudan, what they are going to do it in Egypt. And we need to respect the Egyptian, by the way. The millions who go out there against Morsi, they are not stupid. We need to think louder. So my aid to the South African brothers and sisters, we need to go further, do more research, go to the slums, go see what the Muslim brothers have done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. I just want to ask a question. What will the Muslim Brotherhood or the people of Egypt do to reconcile the military interest with the geopolitical interest in the region to the will of the people? What steps have you taken to consider all these factors and to deal with them?
Thank you. I'll ask Yahya Hamid to respond first, and Deputy Minister.
I'll start with the mistakes. And definitely there are a lot of mistakes. I mentioned some achievements. I mentioned three main off-roads and mistakes that I believe if things go back, we would have really went the other way. The first one is on the 11th of February 2011, when all the political movements and parties in Egypt, as well as a lot of the movements, not all the movements, but a lot of the movements have accepted the army roadmap, to be part of the army roadmap, i.e. not completing the revolutionary path. And I believe that being part of the roadmap that being designated by Mubarak himself in order to give the authority for the SCAF, which is the army rulers, was a mistake. If things goes back, I believe that people should have been in the streets, Muslim Brotherhood as well as others shouldn't have left Tahrir until a real cleaning and a real freedom and restructure for the main institutes should have taken place. The second one is we thought that building the constitutional frameworks and building the institutions in itself is very important in order to bring stability and in order to show the will of the people. I believe if time goes back again, we could not press hard in order to finish the parliamentary elections as well as the constitution. Rather, we would have waited in order to reach as much consensus as possible in this area. And this would bring, again, what I have mentioned for the inclusiveness. But His Excellency, the Deputy Minister, has said that during our cabinet, the third cabinet, we were only 30% of the cabinet. And during the first cabinet, we were only 10%. But still, I believe that the mistake was not specifically in the inclusiveness. It was partially on depending on the autocrats, technocrats, on the technocrats of the government. The technocrats of the government mentally belong to the deep state. So part of the bureaucracy, part of not having a fast track for the steps and fast tracks for the projects, especially in the social justice, were really below than the expectations of the people in the streets. I wouldn't mention the justifications for the problem. Every one of this has got a real good justification, but I believe we have to be honest with ourselves that these things might have changed. For the Palestinian cause, actually it's not the Palestinian cause, we believe it's our cause as well. And let me remind ourselves and remind my brother about the position of Dr. Morsi and his government during Gaza problems that happened in November, December after his being in office, and how the Prime Minister, along with other ministers, along with our head of the parliament, Dr. Saad al-Katatni, who is now in jail, have visited Gaza and have put an end into the coming attack on Gaza. It's a deep question, and actually I cannot mention it in a couple of minutes, the both questions about the restructure of the army. But definitely we will be depending on a lot of the benchmarks and success stories, as the ambassador here said, that we have to see how things will change in the army. We have a lot of things. We have ideas and not ideas. We have plan how to change the upper and how to change in the middle level of the army, and have to do a restructure in the army. And this should be done not only in the army, actually in a lot of the institutes, as well as the judiciary system, as well as the police and the media, and how to make not a reconciliation but a real change that understands that the revolution was against these institutions and was against the torture that happened for the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, for tens of years inside the so-called Amn al-Dawla, without us going after the revolution in order to have the revenge. Rather, we said we will try to reconcile for the benefit of the nation, but now we believe that bringing them into real justice, bringing them into the real rule of law is something inevitable in order to create a stable and a real democratic country. I believe I covered this all, and I would agree in some of the ideas that was mentioned about the mistakes. I would agree as well that because we believed in democracy, we allowed people. Actually, we didn't allow people. Actually, the revolution allowed people to be in the streets by hundreds of thousands, even if you want to consider them millions, even consider this million. But this is democracy. When people were in Tahrir Square, whatever you see the number, we know the number that it was not what was mentioned at all, because the whole Cairo is 12 million only. But regardless of this. But at the same time, we had other hundreds and thousands and millions were in Rabaa Square and other squares of Egypt that is pro the system, that's pro-democracy, not in favor of Dr. Morsi. And even in France, for example, Holland won with 51%. And his popularity reached 27%, which is very low. And this wouldn't make the army of France or other democratic countries to support one sect against the other. This is not the rule of the army. This is the rule of politics and political votes, and we were going to have a parliamentary elections. Actually, the president called for parliamentary elections that was suppressed then by the court, in order to have the real will of the people cleared in the ballot boxes. And then the president said that if the majority came from other than the Muslim Brotherhood and other people who were pro the system, then they would call him to step down by the democratic process, not against the democratic process. Unfortunately, if we allow the military coup to stand in Egypt, we are making a real turbulence, not only in Egypt, rather in Africa, and I would say in the whole world. It's not to bring back Muslim Brotherhood into power at all, because we have always called for inclusiveness, but to bring the calls of the people, real democratic path again. And without the democratic path, unfortunately, I back what was said from the deputy minister, that we will find some radicals who don't belong to us, but definitely will abrupt, because people will say, if we went to the ballot boxes and our voices were not heard, our expressions were not respected, then we have to go the other route. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, we have engaged bilaterally at the very beginning with the Egyptians. We had discussions with the Department of Foreign Affairs and all the relevant parties. And our president and our minister has offered the Egyptian that we would like to engage them bilaterally to see what is the way forward as far as the Egyptian society is concerned. The problem here is, you see, the army has been entrenched in Egypt for a long period. From the time of the overthrow of King Farouk, there has been military rule in the sense that it is the military that was in charge from Nasser to Anwar Sadat to Mubarak. And it's not easy. You can see in Turkey, it's a process. It's not easy to get rid of the military in the sense that they should not have control. And the ingredients of a democracy is that the army must be a professional army under the control of the civilian government, no matter what government there is. Our army is under the control of our government, and tomorrow we have a change of government. It doesn't matter. The army will still be under the control of the civilian government. We had Indonesia after the overthrow of Sukarno. The Suharto ruled in a very repressive manner in Indonesia until the changes took place there. So you have a problem of got to transform the question of army, that they should have a professional army in a democracy. Now that is easily said than done. It's a process that the democratic forces will have to engage in. And particularly, you know, the another ingredient, of course, is the question of free press and free political activities, which does not exist in Egypt at the moment, you see. So we need to urge the Egyptian, the Western powers. I think the United States could play a role, because after all it is the United States that was supplying money to the army and keeping at the Egyptian army. And what role the United States and the West. Already there are signs now that the Western countries may endorse the referendum and the constitution, with all the army being playing the role, not only in government, but the army has they entrench themselves in the economy of the country. Now, how do you get the army out of the economy of the country? So I think that we would, as South Africans, we were hoping through the African Union and try and work for a inclusive government. We don't think, and I don't think that this government as constituted now is going to bring stability to that country. Already there are signs of violence emerging. If you do not solve the problem, you take the question of Syria, because the inability of all the parties in Syria to come together to resolve the problem, you have created very fertile ground now for the Al-Qaeda elements to move in. And now they're becoming very, very strong. It's difficult now. It will be very difficult to get rid of that Al-Qaeda element. There are signs now that maybe the Al-Qaeda type of elements would move in, because where there is the instability, that's the fertile ground for them to move in. And if that happens, I think that will be very serious consequences. Egypt is an important country for Africa. As I said, NASA played an important role. Unfortunately, Mubarak was not very much committed to Africa. When we had a non-aligned conference here, you know, NASA played an important part in the non-aligned movement, but he didn't come. When the African Union was launched, Mubarak didn't come. But Mursi had wanted to change that, and he said even to our president that, look, no, he feels that Egypt is an African country, and he's going to concentrate more on the politics of Africa and the development in Africa, and he's going to play an important role. Thank you.
Thank you.